Ngayon ay bumulusok ang lahat ng national currencies kasama ang Philippine Peso kontra US Dollar. Marami ang hindi nauunawaan ang malalim na dahilan nito. Marami pa nga isinisisi kay Pangulong Marcos ang pagbagsak ng piso sa pinakabago nitong all-time rate kung saan umabot ng 58 pesos ang $1. Ang hindi alam ng marami, ito na ang hudyat ng napipitong tuluyang pagkabura ng US dollar sa international financial system ng buong mundo. Tandaan, ang US dollar ay isa lamang fiat money. Ibig sabihin, isa lang itong perang papel na umaandar sa merkado base sa credit system ng mga bangko. Bilang isang Federal Reserve note, ang US dollar ay hindi commodity money. Walang physical tangible wealth asset na nakabackup dito kundi umiikot lamang ito sa utang. Ibig sabihin, ang pag-imprenta ng US dollar bills ay wala ng kontrol. Ipiniprenta ito ng Central Bank ng Amerika o ng Federal Reserve System kahit wala itong backup na kayamanan. Ang todong pagtaas ng value ng US dollar ay isang malaking senyales sa lahat ng mga naglalakihang multi-billion dollar corporations na malapit na itong maging basura na lang. Wala pa alam-alam ang mga tao ng mga kumpanyang Amazon, Walmart at iba pang biglang nag-cancel ng bilyong dolyar na investments. Hindi lang yan ang nangyayari. Ito lang Agosto pinagputos ni Pope Francis na kailangang maibalik na lahat ng mga assets or gold etc. ng Vatican sa iba't ibang mga bansa sa kanilang central bank bago magtapos ang September 13, 2022. Ang pagkamatay ni Queen Elizabeth II ay hindi lang nangangahulugan ng pagtatapos ng isang panahon ng monarkiya, kundi ito rin ay nangangahulugan rin ng pagtatapos ng isang pandaigdigang sistema. Sistemang may kinalaman sa international financial and banking system, economic system, global governmental structures at monumental change of geopolitics. Ang agarang pagpunta ni Pangulong Ferdinand Marcos Jr. sa Singapore, Indonesia at Amerika ay nagpapahiwatig ng isang matinding bagay na may biglaang magaganap. Isang kaganapan na hindi makakalimutan ng lahat ng mga tao sa buong mundo, at ito ay ang pagkawala ng lahat ng mga national governments mula sa pang-aalipin ng utang. Sa pagbagsak ng US dollar ay siya namang pagpapakawala ng milyong-milyong bulyon ng mga ginto ng iba't ibang mga bansa na kinuntol ng mga elitistang banking kabal sa loob ng mga habang panahon pabalik sa kanya-kanyang may-ari ng mga ito. Inumpisaan ng Russia at China, susunod ang lahat ng mga bansa, kasali ang mismong Amerika, sa tuluyang pagpapalit ng sistemang pinansyal ng buong mundo at ng utang base sa dolyar ay biglang mabubura. Magkakaroon ng isang buong liwayway sa pandaigdigang eksena. Bawat bansa ay magbabalik sa gold standard international monetary system. At ang people of the Philippine Islands na siyang itinalaga ni Pangulong Ferdinand E. Marcos na co-owner at co-beneficiary ng Wealth for Humanity ang magiging bagong Amerika sa Asia na siyang maharlika. Ang pagpapatunog ni PBBM ng bell ng New York Stock Exchange noong September 19, 2022 ay hindi lamang ito simpleng seremonya ng pagtatapos ng stock market ng araw na yaon. Ito rin ay nagpapahiwatig ng stock market crash o recession na magaganap kung saan tuluyan ng ibabasura ang US dollar at tudyat ng pagbabalik ng buong mundo sa gold standard. At bilang signatory na magbubukas ng Wealth for Humanity, tumindig si Pangulong Ferdinand Marcos Jr. bilang representante ng 110 milyon Filipinos na siyang kinikilala ng United Nations bilang co-signatory ng mga kayamanang ito. Propesya ay nagdagaganap.
Habang linalatag ang mga plano at minamarkahan ang ating mga dapat marating sa mga susunod na buwan, wala akong kaduda-duda na magagawa lahat ito. Maliwanag sa akin, walang kakulangan sa galing ng Pilipino. Nakakatiyak pati ako na walang imposible sa ating mga pangarap para sa bayan. Nasa dugo natin ang yaman na magbabangon sa atin. Maraming salamat sa inyong walang sawang pagsuporta.
A new gold standard for the dollar? It's coming, and when it does, it'll be good news for your cost of living and a more prosperous economy. I'm Steve Forbes, and this is What's Ahead, where you get the insights you need to help navigate this turbulent world. The dollar and the rising price of gold are not campaign issues this year, but they will be by the next election in 2024. The result will be something that sounds utterly astonishing today, and that is a serious discussion about a new gold standard for the U.S. What is a gold standard? It means the dollar price of gold would be fixed. Today, that might be, say, $2,000 an ounce. From the 1930s to the early 1970s, when we were on a formal gold standard, the dollar was fixed at $35 an ounce. If the price went above or below $35 an ounce, measures, such as adjusting interest rates, would immediately be taken to get it back to that $35 level. Why gold? For a variety of reasons, gold keeps its intrinsic value better than anything else in the world. We have 4,000 years of experience to back that statement. When you see the price fluctuate, what you see is the value of the dollar fluctuating. Gold's value is fixed. The dollar's value is not. The U.S. was on a gold standard from the time of George Washington until the early 1970s, when the dollar's formal link to gold was mistakenly severed. The gold standard was a key reason why, despite wars, depressions, and plenty of political turmoil, the U.S. had the greatest economic growth in human history. Since the 1970s, when the U.S. mistakenly ditched the gold standard, economic growth rate averages have fallen substantially. That's why the cost of living keeps going up. It's called inflation. We take for granted that when you go to buy a pound of cheese, the amount of cheese you get doesn't change each day. The same when you buy a quart of milk or a gallon of gasoline. Money is a measure of value. It should be fixed like that pound or quart. The value of the dollar is weakening as the Federal Reserve, our central bank, prints up globs of new money to help pay for all those COVID rescue packages. Those packages were needed, but without getting technical, the Fed is printing this money in a way that could bring big problems down the road. There are mountains of myths surrounding the gold standard, all of them wrong. So get ready. The debate about gold is coming. I'm Steve Forbes.
Can we and should we see another gold standard? This is the main theme of our discussion with Jan Nieuwenhuis, gold analyst at the Gold Observer. Jan, welcome to the show. It's a pleasure to have you on Kitco.
Thank you, David. Thank you very much for having me.
Let's start with talking about a gold standard. Can you give us a brief history of the last gold standards we've seen and why you think we might return to one soon?
Well, a gold standard is more or less a disciplined system where countries peg their currencies to gold, and it more or less brings discipline into the system, and you tie the currency supply to gold, so there isn't much room to print unlimited amounts of money as we're doing now, which is very destructive for an economy. As you can see now, there are a lot of financial bubbles, there are excessive debt levels, inequality is rising, you get moral hazard, and all these side effects of a fiat money standard are not really what we want, and eventually you get a lot of monetary instability, and I think then at that point we have to get back to a gold standard.
The Philippines and Serbia are joining a slew of central banks that are increasing their gold holdings. They follow a global trend of other central banks accumulating bullion in a move seen as a shift away from the U.S. dollar as a standard. This global trend, by the way, was led by Russia and China. So what does it really mean? Well, there are few people who know more about gold than Peter Schiff. And he is good enough to join us now with his take on this. Peter, why are countries doing this? And I guess it bears asking, right? As an American, what does this mean? What does this mean to me? What does it mean for us?
Well, I think it means a lot for Americans because we have enjoyed the extraordinary privilege of being able to create out of thin air the reserve currency. And before the dollar was the reserve, gold was the reserve. And the reason that the dollar became the reserve is because it was as good as gold, because the dollar was not only backed by gold, but redeemable in gold. In fact, the dollar was gold. It was Federal Reserve notes that were IOUs for dollars, which were made of gold. And we went off the gold standard in 1971, but I think the world is going to go back on it. Because I think the days where the dollar is the reserve currency are numbered, and we're going back to basics. Everything old is new again. Gold was money in the past, and it will be money again in the future. And central banks that are smart enough to read that writing on the wall are increasing their gold reserves now.
Well, if we don't have gold and we stay with something like what we have now in the United States, we're then able to manipulate currency in such a way so that we can, for example, print money when we're in the middle of a recession or worse. If we go to the gold standard, for example, if it becomes global and we have to end up accepting it ourselves, that would not be good for us, right? In terms of getting out of these sticky wickets we've been in, like in 2008.
Well, first of all, the only reason we get into those sticky wickets is because of the Federal Reserve. So the Federal Reserve lights the fire and then pretends to put it out.
if we go back on the gold standards, we take the matches away from the Fed. So they can't light the fire, so there's nothing to put out. You know, gold and economic freedom go hand in hand. And if you don't believe me, just ask Alan Greenspan, because he authored an article, Gold and Economic Freedom, which I would recommend that people read. But, you know, gold is the enemy of the welfare state and big government. That's why governments don't like gold. They want paper. But the problem is eventually the paper has no value. And we are headed to a currency crisis in the United States. And what's going to put the United States back on a gold standard is to try to stop the free fall of the dollar. You know, they're going to postpone it as long as possible. You know, when Nixon took us off the gold standard, he said it was temporary. He was right, it was temporary, but it just lasted a lot longer than people thought.
Because of what the Dow's done this month, because of what we saw yesterday with the yield on bonds and several other indicators, people are saying that it's not looking like anything other than likely at this point that we will be hit with a recession, probably at some point in 2020. In fact, that's what Guggenheim is reporting this morning. Do you agree with that assessment?
Well, not just a recession, the recession. It is going to be worse than the last one, which was the worst one since the Great Depression. We call it the Great Recession. The next one is going to be greater. And what's going to make it that much more problematic, especially here in America, is the resurgence of inflation. This is going to be an inflationary recession. We called it stagflation when it happened in the 1970s, except this is going to be a lot worse. A much weaker economy than the one we had then, and much more inflation, except there is no Jimmy Carter and Paul Volcker waiting at the end of the decade to save us. Instead of going hard right, we're going hard left. We're going to go to modern monetary theory and a democratic socialist, which means they're going to run the presses full steam, and that's what I think is going to crash the dollar, and ultimately, which would bring us back to gold.
Peter Schiff, always a great...
Sustainability also requires development policies that go beyond the traditional metrics. We already know that the gross domestic product is an incomplete measure of progress, and that vulnerability is multidimensional. Our development agenda must also take into account the interest of all developing nations, including middle-income countries where the majority of the world's poor live. At the same time, sustainability means equipping our people with the tools they need to meet the challenges of the fourth industrial revolution.
Ito ay ipagpatuloy natin. Ito ang pagkakaisa ng ating bansa. Ang pagkakaisa ng Pilipinas, ang pagkakaisa muli ng mga Pilipino. Ipalalapitin natin ulit ang ating mga kababayan na maramdaman ulit sa kanilang kalooban at isabuhay ang nationalism, ang pagmamahal sa Pilipinas. Yan po ang ating hangarin, yan po ang ating layunin. Sa suporta ninyo, ay maaabot po natin itong pangarap na ito. Ito po ang hamon sa atin ng ating mga kababayan. Ito ang hinihingi at inaasahan sa atin ng ating mga kababayan. Sa tulong ninyo, maaabot po natin ang panahon na magkaisa ulit ang Pilipino, mataas ang buong kahit na kanino, isang bansa, isang diwa, isang gawa. Yan po ang ating pangarap. Yan po. Maraming salamat po.
Filipino future, this nation shall be great again.